Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Young and Wifed Up. Thank you for joining me today for another episode. This is Gabby, and I'm going to be solo for today's episode. If you are new here, welcome. This is the Young and Wifed Up podcast. I have been co hosting this podcast with my sister Marcella for 4 years, and our podcast covers various topics relevant to Christian women, including homemaking, motherhood, homeschooling, wellness, and just practical Christian living. Before I jump into today's episode, I want to share a few things. The first is a trigger warning. This episode is going to include graphic descriptions of pregnancy complications, pregnancy loss, and grief. And also a warning if you have a personal relationship with me, today's episode may be upsetting for you to hear. So I want to give a warning just in case because of the graphic nature of what I'm going to be talking about today. If it's going to be upsetting for you, I recommend skipping this episode or maybe listening to it later on. Another thing I wanted to share is that my sister Marcella, who co-hosts with me, has shared her experience with losing her first baby to miscarriage in episode number 39, and you can find it by searching in our podcast search bar, infertility and pregnancy loss. And that was filmed in 2021, so 3 years ago. Around this time, actually, is when we did that episode. And I recently re-listened to this episode, the one that my sister talked about her pregnancy loss. And I was encouraged once again by her bravery in sharing her story. And I highly recommend listening to it because every pregnancy loss experience is so different. If you have gone through or are currently going through a loss, you may be able to gain something different from each of our stories. I also speak about my journey with infertility in that particular episode, and we both talk in length about the ways that you can support women in your life that may be going through either experience. If you know me in real life, and after listening to my story today, and you may be wondering how you can support me or support me and my husband, this episode that I'm recommending, episode number 39, is a great place to start because we just talk in length about ways that you can support people that are going through pregnancy loss. So many of you who follow my social media accounts, or if you're in the Young and Wifed Up Facebook group, saw my announcement that I made on May 17th that we had conceived and lost our first baby. I decided that I would share on the podcast while it's still kind of fresh because I couldn't, in good conscience, continue to make content without addressing the life and death of our child. I also decided that I would share the more graphic details of losing the baby because I think that there is a lot of misinformation about what miscarriage is actually like for families that go through it, especially maybe miscarriage that's maybe on the tail end of the first trimester. When we received the news of our child's death, I searched high and low on the internet for details on what I could be preparing for based on how many weeks pregnant I was. There's not a lot of Christian resources out there for women that go through this, especially when it comes to the graphic details of delivery. We had to make a lot of very hard decisions during this experience, including what to do with our child's body if we recovered it. And I will not be shying away from these details because I believe that it could genuinely help someone to find support if they have gone through something similar, or it can help somebody who is preparing to miscarry, like I was myself a couple weeks ago. A large number of the women in my life have experienced pregnancy loss, And I have witnessed firsthand how each experience is extremely different and unique. I also have been reading and listening to many miscarriage stories over the past couple weeks, and although each one is so different, it really does help me personally in my healing to hear from women who have experienced the pain of losing a child. And I pray that as more women speak out about the traumatic nature of pregnancy loss, that the women that go through this will feel less alone and it will be less stigmatized, and the community that is around them and supports them will have a deeper compassion and understanding for them, even if those around them themselves haven't gone through pregnancy loss. We as Christians are called to be compassionate and love the brethren. And I don't believe that we have to exactly completely relate to one another in suffering, but having compassion and love and serving each other in Christ really makes a huge difference in the healing process. At least it did for us. So please forgive me if I'm a little bit shaky in this episode. I know that I'm more upbeat and articulate typically, but because of the freshness of this experience, it's a little bit harder for me to get through this without, getting choked up or losing my breath or, maybe just even like having a brain, like fog. um, so please forgive me as I talk about this. And if it sounds like scripted in some parts and then other parts sounds like I'm just talking freely to you guys, I'm going to be using my journal entries as kind of a guide for me to stay on track of the timeline and details of things. Thankfully, I was encouraged to journal after everything had happened, and I'm really glad that I did, because I think that putting everything out of my head and onto paper was really helpful for me to process the loss, and also helps me to look back and see God's hand and mercy on me. So, I'm going to get into it, and some things I, will plan to keep private, as far as like the nature of when we found out we were pregnant, or like the details of, the pregnancy itself, because some of those things I want to keep close to my heart, especially like the day that we found out we were pregnant, my friends and family that we are very close to, our church family that we told the news to. Those experiences are something that I will cherish for the rest of my life, because our baby was loved and celebrated from the very beginning. My husband and I decided very early, and even before we got pregnant, that we believed our child's life mattered, no matter how old they were or how long they had been alive. And so we shared freely to the people in our direct community that we had conceived and we got pregnant in mid-March. And it was a huge blessing to us. If you're new here and you don't know our personal story, I talk about it in that episode that I had recommended earlier. But that was 3 years ago. And at that point, we had been struggling with infertility for 2 years or 3 years. Yeah, 3 years at that point. And we approached in March the 5.5-year mark of not conceiving at all. And I have polycystic ovarian syndrome. I struggle with other chronic conditions, but what affects my fertility the most is the polycystic ovarian syndrome. And I had a lot of my symptoms had gone into remission, and I talk about it a lot on the podcast. A lot of the things that have helped me put some of those symptoms into remission or managing those symptoms. And And so that was a huge blessing. We did end up deciding after a long time to employ an ovulation induction medication. So all it really did for my body was encourage my ovaries to release an egg. And I believe this was the first time that it happened. I felt it happen. It was a surreal experience, but with polycystic ovarian syndrome, many of the women that have this diagnosis cannot naturally ovulate on their own. So even though we did use a medication to help with ovulation, we believe every pregnancy is a miracle from the Lord. And considering how long we had been trying to conceive and how often I hear that even this medication doesn't work for a lot of women with PCOS, it truly was a miracle that God had opened my womb and we experienced so much joy and excitement, but also a very sobering reality that women with PCOS have a higher chance of miscarriage than a woman that doesn't have PCOS or another reproductive condition. So, from the beginning, when we were announcing our pregnancy to our church and to our immediate family members and to our closest friends and family friends, we had always premised, that we know that the Lord does what he wills and that he may choose to take our child, and that with my condition, my chances of losing the baby were much higher, and that regardless of what happened with this baby, we wanted this baby to be celebrated and loved and prayed for. And from the beginning, our baby was celebrated, loved, and prayed for. And I do not regret, neither does my husband, making that decision to share with the people that we are the closest to our baby's life. So, I'm going to talk now about when the complications started. So the complications, so we were monitoring my cycle and the pregnancy very closely. One, because I have polycystic ovarian syndrome, and also the OB-GYN that I have was just very proactive, checking my levels constantly. I felt pregnant. I had a lot of pregnancy symptoms. My levels were beautiful for a long time. I felt, very optimistic, although I knew that there was this thing in the back of my mind that it could happen that we lose this baby. I truly felt, peace with, what we were going through. And we just tried to have any anxious thought that would pop into my head. I just tried to have, peace and ask the Lord to help me. And so I didn't think, that anything was wrong until ultrasound day. So we did an ultrasound when I was, I think, 7.5 weeks pregnant. And on ultrasound day, I was experiencing a moderate amount of anxiety leading up to the ultrasound. I think a lot of women do, even if they, don't have the worry of miscarriage. Everybody wants to know that their baby is growing fine and healthy, and, it's a universal experience. You want your child to be okay. And so I had what I believe was a reasonable amount of anxiety. I didn't have any real concerns that something was actually wrong because, again, I was feeling pregnant. I had no cramping, no bleeding, no concerns at all. It was just very standard pregnancy, early pregnancy. So this is when I'm going to try to rely more on my journal for a lot of these details. So I'm sorry if some of this sounds really scriptive. I may stop and start, from the journal and add my, more details if I don't think that I, give enough in the journal. So, our first stop when we got to the OB-GYN office, and again, I'm about 7.5 weeks pregnant at this point. Our first stop was to the ultrasound office, and I got ready for the transvaginal ultrasound. And I have had many of transvaginal ultrasounds in my life. I know how it goes because of my reproductive issues. So, it was pretty standard. The ultrasound tech found the sac, the gestational sac where my baby was, easily inside of my uterus. So any concerns of a fallopian tube pregnancy, like there was nothing like that. The sac was easily seen immediately in my uterus. And she also confirmed that my right ovary had released the egg during ovulation, which is just incredible because I know that I felt it happen. And that was just such a mercy from the Lord because, again, I have never experienced ovulation as far as we know. So the tech found what she believed was the fetal pole, which is the baby itself, and then the yolk sac, which is what feeds the baby until the placenta takes over, essentially. But she couldn't get a clear view of either the fetal pole or the yolk sac. So she decided to go over my belly to try to get a better view. And again, there was no clear view of the baby. So at this point, I start to get worried. But the tech assured me that everything looked healthy and maybe I was wrong about when we conceived and the baby may be a little younger than we originally thought. I immediately had a gut feeling that something was wrong with our baby. Because of how heavily monitored my cycle was, there were only really a few days of variables of when we could have conceived, like truly only about 3 days of a variable. And that shouldn't make as big of a difference on an ultrasound. You should be able to see a 7.5-week-old baby, even if it's a little bit earlier than that. So I met with the doctor afterwards, and she presented a few different reasons why the tech maybe wasn't able to get a clear view of the baby. I tried to reason with myself that maybe everything was really okay, but I just knew in my heart that something was very wrong. I believe in my gut, and again, we won't ever know for sure because, if you listen to the rest of my story, you'll kind of understand we didn't end up getting another ultrasound after that. But I believed that the baby must have died before that day, stopped growing, before that day. But we'll never know for sure. Maybe baby really was on the smaller side, and maybe the baby died after that day. But based on other things that ended up happening, I do believed that baby had died before ultrasound. So after that appointment, we scheduled another ultrasound appointment for a week and a half from then, and they took my blood. So on a few days later, I received my progesterone results, and they were dangerously low. So my progesterone had been consistently high, 20 to 24, which is like pretty good for early pregnancy. And my HCG had been climbing like as expected. There was, again, no concerns from what we were monitoring. But then we got these results back and my progesterone was in the tank and I immediately panicked. So, I'm making calls, including calling my doctor. Once I finally get a hold of the office, which took a long time, I was told that I needed to wait for any intervention until I received my current HCG results. So if you know anything about progesterone in pregnancy, you need your progesterone in order to sustain the life of your child. And so I have a history of low progesterone. I have been on bioidentical progesterone in the past. I've been on hormone replacement therapy with progesterone in the past. It never really did much for me. It didn't really improve my PCOS or anything like that. But so I knew what to do. I asked for a progesterone prescription. I asked for something so that I could try to save my baby's life. And they told me that they weren't going to until we get my other results. And I didn't sleep that night at all. It felt like some sick joke because I had my ultrasound appointment on Monday. I didn't get my progesterone results until Thursday. And then by Thursday, like 4 days had gone by. I was like, are you kidding me? Like this was my result from Monday. Days have gone by and we could have done something, to try to save our child. And so it was a very frustrating experience. And also another layer that was really frustrating. I love my doctor. She's a nurse practitioner. She's great. I haven't had any issues with her. But the thing was, when I was calling the office this, over the next few weeks, I was never able to like communicate with my actual doctor. I had to deal with the medical assistant. And honestly, like the medical assistant just didn't really have any good bedside manner, was kind of rude. And I was just like, you're in a like emotional state of mind, you're having anxiety and you really want to hear from your doctor, but instead I have to talk to the medical assistant and she wasn't, really working with me. So it was just a very frustrating experience. So, I didn't know at that point whether my baby was dead or alive. So the next morning after I got my progesterone results, I called the office back and begged for the progesterone prescription because we still hadn't received my HCG results. And I'm sorry, I didn't explain what HCG is for anybody that doesn't know. So essentially, like if your HCG is like growing and in your pregnancy and the baby is growing fine, your numbers should be climbing. They should be high. So I did end up getting my HCG results back way later that day after I had begged for the progesterone prescription. I finally got the approval from the doctor's office to get the progesterone. I had to call 3 different Walgreens locations until I was finally able to pick it up. And it was just a really frantic day, lots of anxiety, lots of fear. But I did end up getting the prescription. And then, after I had taken my first dose of progesterone, I got my HCG results back. And, they were in the 5,000 range. And, there's like a range for what is, normal and healthy for each week of gestation. And my numbers were technically in range because I think the lowest it could have been was 3,000, but it was still on the low side. So, at that point, we had just decided, you know what? We're going to take the progesterone pills. I'm going to continue to take care of myself in my home and basically like beg the Lord to save our child's life because I knew that there was a very, very, very big chance that my child had already died. So a few days after taking progesterone, I get another call from my OB/GYN office and they said, we want to retest your levels again. So I go back and I had a really frustrating experience that day as well. I checked in at the office. I waited for about an hour to finally be seen by the phlebotomist because they kept forgetting about me. It was a really frustrating experience. I was crying. I was anxious. One of the nurses comforted me until I was seen. But this phlebotomist was like somebody that was filling in for the regular girl that I usually would see. And so the person that was filling in was just really mean and had zero bedside manner. And she couldn't get my vein. And she was just like being very rude and frantic. And it just seemed like, she doesn't realize that she's working in women's healthcare and that you have to be sensitive, So I don't know. It was a really frustrating experience. Again, like I love my doctor, but there's just been like some people that I was dealing with in the past couple weeks in the medical world where I was just like, you see on my chart why I'm here. I'm here because I have a threatened miscarriage. And she was just rude to me. And I was like crying the whole time, trying to keep it together. And she kept saying things like, oh, you're nervous or, why are you crying? And, she was just being very rude. Anyway, I left the appointment very upset. So the day after we took my blood, which again, that was a horrible day because I just had a bad experience getting my blood taken. Early the next morning, I got my results back and my HCG levels had decreased by more than double. So it went from in the 5,000 range to the 2,000 range. And seeing that big of a drop, the baby has died. There's nothing you can do. My progesterone also tanked again. It went from 7 the week before to now 4. And that was while I was still taking the pills for progesterone. So I think even the pills were getting my level to a 4. I think if I wasn't taking the pills, it probably would have been at a 1 or a 0. So we knew that day, that was the day that we found out that our baby had died. And I'm trying to think because there's so much of a blur. I was about 2 days before I was 9 weeks pregnant. So I was 8 weeks, 5 days pregnant when we found out my baby had died. I don't remember a lot from this day because it felt like my worst nightmare was coming true. I stayed in bed. I cried out to God for help. We told our loved ones the news, and we began mentally preparing for the physical trauma I was going to endure. So again, at this point, I wasn't experiencing any bleeding. I wasn't experiencing any cramping at all. Up till the day we found out that our baby had died. I had no warning signs of a miscarriage. None. And this is called a missed miscarriage. And this is something that's a more recent fact for me because most of the people in my life that had pregnancy losses, usually, from what I remember correctly, most of the women that I know, they started bleeding and, then they ended up finding out that they were miscarrying. And so it was kind of a weird experience, like my body was still pregnant. Like I was still experiencing pregnancy symptoms. It was so bizarre. And our baby had died. And so a lot of things started happening. My pregnancy symptoms started disappearing, but I still wasn't bleeding and I wasn't cramping. I noticed that my stomach had felt different. Like as I was going through the pregnancy, my stomach was getting harder, like more firm. And there was just a physical change in my body, a lot of things. And then a couple days before we found out that our baby had died, my stomach felt like squishy again, like it wasn't as firm as it had been. And so there was a lot of things that were kind of building up to this point of I was starting to lose pregnancy symptoms. Yeah, it was a nightmare. It was really hard. I started searching Reddit threads and YouTube videos and basically any resource that could have helped me to prepare for what I was about to endure. Because again, I wasn't bleeding yet. I wasn't cramping yet. And I was about to be 9 weeks pregnant. And so I was like, okay, I don't know what my experience is going to be like because of the week that I'm at, and we don't know exactly when the baby died. I have again, a hunch of when I believe the baby died, but if my body was not essentially registering that the baby had died, it essentially was continuing on with the pregnancy while the baby had already died in my womb. So I knew that it was just going to be more than what people say is a heavy period, which I literally hate that. No miscarriage is a heavy period. I think that is extremely irresponsible for medical professionals to say. I know that a lot of women, when they have what's considered and called in the medical world a chemical pregnancy, which again is just a very early miscarriage between 4 and 6 weeks, or even not before 6 weeks, between 4 and 5 weeks, I think is what the cutoff is for that. That some of those women say that it feels like a super heavy period. But again, the emotional trauma attached to the physical symptoms, it's not the same. It's not a period. It's not the same at all. Even if your symptoms mimic a heavy period, it's not the same because you are losing a child. Like the child had died, it wasn't just like uterine lining, So I hate that there's just so much misinformation, even when it comes to early, chemical pregnancies and stuff like that. So, a lot of the things that I was finding about, the week that I was at and what to expect with a missed miscarriage was that I may either experience this quote unquote heavy period, again, I hate that, but like extremely heavy bleeding, but, not, contractions or anything like that. So I was kind of expecting one or the other based on when we think maybe baby had died, and also if my body was continuing on with the pregnancy. I was kind of preparing myself for like a spectrum of things that could possibly happen. And so one end of the spectrum was, more of this just heavy bleeding, maybe some clotting. And then the other end of the spectrum is contractions, labor, that sort of thing. I ended up finding a blog site called Lost Innocence that's made by like a Christian Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox ministry. And that honestly ended up being the most helpful resource online because they go through each stage of gestation and kind of what to expect in detail. And they even gave details on how we could possibly recover our child's body. We had decided at that time that I was going to pass the baby and deliver the baby naturally at home. And we were watching and monitoring me very closely for signs of infection or hemorrhage or anything that could be concerning that would make us go to the emergency room. But my wishes and my desire, as hard as I knew it was going to be, was to deliver our tiny baby at home. And without medical intervention, without, needing to take a pill to induce that process or a DNC, stuff like that. I wanted to avoid that as much as possible. That was my own choice. I know that a lot of women don't get that choice because they have more complications with their pregnancy loss. So I kind of prepared myself that, if there's a complication, I may not get to have my baby at home. I may need to go to the hospital. They may need to do surgery. I was kind of preparing myself for anything and reading a lot on different experiences and watching a lot of things kind of helped me prepare for any situation. And that's kind of the mercy that I see that the Lord gave me in this missed miscarriage experience because my body hadn't started miscarrying yet and passing the baby. I had quite a few days to prepare myself mentally for any situation. So, that night that we found out that our child had died, my friend Brooke, who lives very close by to me, and I'm very close with her. She's a very sweet friend of mine, that we go to church together. I'm going to cry just talking about her. I haven't even cried yet, and just like talking about her is going to make me cry. So Brooke came over that night, the night that we found out that our baby died. And, we had been communicating with our friends and family, and most of our friends and family live very far away from us because we've only lived in Nevada for just over a year now. So our only friends here in Nevada are our church family. So, a lot of my friends and family in different states felt just super helpless in this situation. And I mean, I would too, if I knew somebody I loved so much was going through this, like I would feel extremely helpless and like I need to hop on a plane. What do I need to do, but thankfully God provided for us in so many different ways in this circumstance. And one of the biggest ways that he provided for us was with Brooke. So Brooke came and stayed with me that night, and she just comforted me, held me, cried with me, and even, helped just talking about other things, just to kind of get my mind off of it for a little while. But that night she gave me something very special, and that was the details of her own loss. And I'm not going to talk about it here because that's her story, and I want to respect her privacy and her own story and her own ability to share it. But I didn't realize how much I needed that. That night needed to hear, the details of her loss, um, and hear her grief. But it was a precious gift to me, a sister sharing grief with another sister. I cried with her for her lost child. We cried over my lost child, And at this point, I wasn't experiencing the physical symptoms yet, but it was just extreme grief had just poured over me. Mourning was already happening. And that night, having her come and physically be there with me and sit in bed with me and just share, her own experience with me was just such a treasure. Anyway, I'm really, really trying not to cry when I'm talking because I don't want Ryan to have to edit this podcast. Because we've just been so overwhelmed and busy with stuff here at home, and he's been taking care of me and doing double duty. He's working and taking care of everything in the house, and I just want him to be able to just easily crop the beginning and end of the podcast and not have to edit through me crying for hours and hours. So, okay. So, many of the days, the day after we found out that our baby had died so that was a Wednesday till Sunday. Yeah, those days are kind of muddled together. I was in bed the whole time, and we cried and we prayed and we just mourned, Ryan and I together. Excuse me. And I had sent Ryan to gather some supplies that could help us for, the delivery process if I was able to do it at home. And again, that was something I was really praying for. And something very specific that I was praying for is that God would give me supernatural peace and comfort in this experience, because it was so hard and so painful, even just the news of our child's death, that I just didn't know how I could have the strength to physically go through the miscarriage without God's peace, true peace, not fluffy, not a surface level peace, a deep, in my soul peace. I was asking for that from the day that we found out our baby had died. So I started bleeding on the 9th of May, and that was the day after we found out our baby had passed. And on the 9th, it was dark and light pink, and it was mixed with cervical mucus. And it was very little. It was kind of almost like spotting. But I knew that it was starting. And I understood, okay, my body's finally recognizing that our child has gone and it's preparing to deliver. The 10th and the 11th, which was Friday and Saturday. And so at this point, I was now 9 weeks pregnant. The blood had changed to bright red. And it also started to be clotty. Smaller clots were coming out of me. And at this point, our church had already started to feed us. They fed us for a week and a half, including all the DoorDash gift cards and even cards that people had sent us that don't live here. That was a huge weight off of our shoulders so that we can just focus on, I could focus on resting and preparing. And I, at this point I was starting to physically feel pain. And then also Ryan, who was taking care of me, he didn't have to worry about cooking dinners and stuff. So that was a huge blessing. Everyone was praying for us. And again, I continued to ask God for this supernatural peace and comfort. as the bleeding started to progress. These were very, very dark and sad days in a lot of ways. Just like, again, the cloud of death was just very strong over us. So I tried to, not distract myself, but fill the time that I was in bed with edifying things. I was reading Elizabeth Elliot's Keep a Quiet Heart. Beautiful book. I'm halfway through. I was also listening to a couple books, one by Thomas Brooks, and it's a Puritan book called Smooth Stones for Ancient Brooks. Very beautiful book. I just finished it today, actually. And then I was also watching comfort shows like The Office. That's like my go-to comfort show. And I was also rewatching Lost in Space, which is a Netflix series that I've talked about before on the podcast. And it was also just like a comfort show, something predictable, not a lot of blood or horror, And then I also spent my time reading and watching pregnancy loss stories. And I know that may seem like confusing, like why would I want to do that while I'm experiencing it, but it genuinely did help me to like mentally prepare and also process what I was going through, and also just felt like this like community aspect of like not being alone and knowing that other women had gone through this and that they came out of it, and they made it through. And also Brooke came a couple times during those few days to, sit with me. And usually Ryan would go on just long walks during that time, and he needed some time to grieve and be alone as well. So things started to ramp up on the 12th, which was the Lord's Day. We were watching our worship service online as my cramping started to become more and more intense. It felt like there was a progression of contracting, and it was normally centered in my uterus, but some was happening in my back as well, and it was very painful. But at that point, like, ibuprofen was enough to help me. Again, I've gone through, because of my PCOS, I've gone through extremely heavy and painful bleeding before, and on this day, on the Lord's Day, the cramping and the bleeding that I was experiencing, like, it wasn't as bad as the worst period that I've ever had. And so it felt like there was a progression. It felt like there was contractions happening, and I was like, okay. And as the contractions were starting to get more and more intense, I had to like be on my hands and knees and kind of do a rocking motion. I was having to like moan and like do things to kind of like soothe my body while it was going through it. And I ended up passing about 4 or 5 very large clots for like about like 3 hours it was happening. And again, this is, the reality of the graphic nature of this experience. I wanted to retrieve our child's body if it was possible. So from the advice of that Lost Innocence blog, which was so helpful, I had a colander, like a white kitchen colander, in between my toilet seat and my toilet bowl. And so as I was like passing the clots, the bigger clots were, caught by the colander. And I was carefully, after each time of passing the clots, I would pick them up and in my hand, and I would search through the clots for our child's body, for the gestational sac. Because again, at this time, we didn't know how big it was, because we didn't know how old the baby was when they died. This is a kind of pain that I wouldn't wish on anybody. Searching for your child's body in blood, in clots, is very hard. But I was like on adrenaline. I was determined to find our child's body if I possibly could. But I just wasn't confident that my baby was in any of the clots. And I started to grieve that maybe the baby had passed during that time, during the 4 or 5 big clots that I passed. I was worried that the baby was in those clots, but it was coming out in pieces that I couldn't identify, because that is also something that can happen. And so, I just tried to have peace. I did end up like flushing those clots down the toilet. And I was like, I don't think that my baby's body was in those clots, but I need to have peace that it may be the case. And I did everything I could to try to find them. And there's just nothing I could do. It was really hard. That night, our pastor came over, and he came upstairs into our bedroom, and him and Ryan set up dinner for us, and he just ministered to us while I was in bed, and ministered to both Ryan and I. And that was a huge mercy to us. He has been very involved. Well, he has been very involved in our life since we've moved here, even before I moved here, when we were telling him we wanted to move here. But just in the past 3 weeks, or really this entire pregnancy experience, our pastor has been so intimately involved with us and truly just being a shepherd to us. And that is something that has made a world of difference for both my husband and I. And I'm so grateful to our pastor for that. I remember that night, that Sunday night, after he had left, pastor left, I slept very, very hard. And I think maybe I had started mentally deciding, because my cramping and my contractions had stopped. I was like, maybe that was it, maybe those clots that I had passed that day, maybe that was it. And so I slept really hard that night, and I think it's because God was preparing me for the next day. So May 13th, Monday, this is the day that I delivered baby Eden. I remember waking up and thinking, wow, I slept so good, God gave me a very, very restful night after many, many, many restful nights. I don't think I'd slept that good since I got pregnant, because even, anybody who's been pregnant knows that you struggle with insomnia and also getting up to pee every couple hours. And yeah, so that was probably the best I'd slept in a month and a half or 2 months. It was pretty crazy. I thought that maybe if I had mentally decided, I think that Sunday was the day, that we had passed the baby. I started telling our loved ones, I started sending texts, and some of you listening maybe got a text from me saying, I think that our baby passed, and I think we delivered it, and, we couldn't recover the body, and I was just kind of asking for prayer, for peace, and also just praying that I could recover. And so after that, I started cleaning up the bathroom. I even threw away the colander that I was using to catch the blood clots, because I was like, maybe I just need to put this part of this miscarriage behind me and now just focus on healing and grieving. So I thought, if I throw things away and just kind of clean things up, maybe, I can have some closure, and just focus on grieving. However, I had just like this gut feeling that it wasn't over. I mean, I was still bleeding, but the bleeding had kind of died down a little bit. Again, the cramping and contracting had died down. It didn't stop, but it had died down enough to where I was like, well, maybe that was it. But I don't know. I just had this feeling like maybe I haven't passed the baby yet. So as I was cleaning up the bathroom, literally, Ryan and I laughed to Ryan out loud about it later on. I just threw away the colander that was catching the clots. As I was doing that, I started laboring. And this was different. This was so different than anything I've ever experienced. And after talking again to my friend Brooke, who was like, besides Ryan, was like my biggest support in this entire process, she was like, yeah, like what you were experiencing was labor. Like she was like, I was like explaining to her what was happening. And she was like, yeah, like this was different. And I know it was different because it was like rhythmic and it was very intense, but then it would stop and slow down. And it was my uterus and my back. And it was at the same time. And it was getting, as each time would die down, it would get more and more intense. And these felt nothing like the cramps or contractions that I was feeling the day before. I think because of how large the clots that I was passing on Sunday were, I think that I, did have to dilate a certain amount. So that's probably why the cramping and contracting was intense on Sunday. But this day, Monday, it was so different. And so I started to feel like this is getting crazy. And I was in so much pain. And I started to feel nauseated, and I could also feel like energy, like almost like, how you could feel like the blood drained from you. Like it felt like that. I felt like I was getting drained. And so I was sitting on the toilet as I like started to labor, and more large clots started coming out of me about the size of what they were the day before. And so at this time, I had thrown away the colander, and I, again, had this determination to find our child's body. So I was frantically scooping the clots out of the toilet with my hands. So disgusting. Like, again, I was like on adrenaline and was so determined. And I was like rinsing them off with saline solution in Ryan's sink, and we just started saving the clots in a jar just because I wanted to be able to search them better later, but because it was happening like over and over, and it was like really intense. And so the contractions started to intensify to a level that I was like, I couldn't stay quiet anymore. So I started yelling out, and for some reason that was like helping. I don't know why. Like it wasn't like helping the pain, but it was helping because I felt like I had all this like pent up energy in my body, and like yelling helped like getting it out. And I started yelling and screaming because I felt like that was the only thing that was helping. And it was just, again, instinctual. Like I was feeling this intense full body experience, and I was like yelling out. And Ryan at this time gave me some heavy painkillers. But they didn't end up kicking in really until after the baby had come. So, but I knew what was coming. Like I felt peace, and I didn't feel fear. I felt like, I need extra help, and Ryan needs help, because Ryan started to panic at this point, like, which was so understandable because I was yelling and screaming. So I told him to call Brooke, because Brooke had basically said, like, if you need me, like, call, and I'll be there, we'll make it happen. And, in God's providence, her husband had come home from work the second Ryan called, and we called and told her that she needed to come immediately. Like, I needed her now and then, and so did Ryan. Yeah, thinking about my poor husband being like so frantic and so panicked, in that moment, because like you're watching your wife be in so much pain, and, I knew what was happening because I was feeling it in my body, but like, it's hard to communicate, like, this is normal as I'm screaming, But I was in extreme pain. This is probably the most intense full body experience I've ever experienced in my life. I've never been pregnant before then, so I've never experienced this, but I knew God created my body to do this. Like I could do this. And I was like mentally like stable. Like I was like, I know that our baby's coming and it's going to be okay. And we need some help and we need some support, So I trusted my body, and also I was just trusting in the Lord that created mine and my baby's body, that he was going to protect us and be there for us. So I moved from the toilet to the edge of the bathtub as we were waiting for Brooke, and I leaned over the edge of the tub because I felt like I was going to throw up at one point. I didn't end up throwing up. I just like felt extreme nausea. I don't know if it was from the pain or from the anxiety. Brooke was on her way, and she told Ryan, start filling up the tub with hot water, and that could help. It may help Gabby with her pain. So he helped me climb into the tub, and I took off my underwear and sat in the tub, and I had like a long t-shirt on, and I just kind of sat in the tub and continued to labor for, maybe around 5 minutes before Brooke finally arrived. And again, I'm like still like the contractions are like ramping up, and my whole body is like, I'm like shaking, I'm sweating, it was insane. I heard her coming finally. I heard her like running up the stairs. And I felt like, okay, everything's going to be okay. Ryan had extra support and the assurance that he needed that I wasn't dying, and that we didn't need to go to the hospital. And I also had my friend to comfort me, and something that I feel very passionate about, and something that I really desired even for, this baby. I desired to have a midwife. I desired to have a doula. I desired to have, a very specific experience when, praying and hoping that this baby would be delivered full term. But I didn't, I didn't get to experience that. But something that I feel very passionate about is that like women have been helping women deliver babies since the beginning of time. And I just think it's like a beautiful experience for a woman to help another woman give birth. It's just like this beautiful thing that sisters can do for each other. And, I didn't get to experience that with a living child, and I pray one day that I will. But that God provided again this little mercy for me in the midst of so much pain, that he brought my friend, this beautiful woman and sister in Christ, to be there and help me deliver our very tiny, small child. When she had gotten there and I was in the tub and things were kind of getting crazy, I truly felt that again, that supernatural peace of God, that deep soul-filling peace of God that I had been praying for. I felt that in that moment, in that time that I was in the tub delivering our tiny baby. And Brooke was like holding me as I was like yelling and crying out, and the hot water was helping, and the sound, even the sound of the faucet running, like the water running, was comforting. And I'm hearing Ryan praying out loud to the Lord to help me, and he's like holding onto my leg, holding onto my hand. And it was just like this moment of the three of us like waiting on the Lord to deliver me from this intense full body experience for several minutes, until finally the last final push came and I felt the baby leave my body, and it like kind of shot out into the water, and I could see blood, coming out. And I took a breath for a moment and was like trying to like calm myself down for a minute. And then I picked up the baby, the sack, from the water, and I handed it to Ryan. And Ryan gently laid it into the sink, and laid a cut, like not that long after, he ended up putting it in the jar, which we had planned. We were going to put it in the jar. We were going to put saline in it because that was one of the ways that blog, Lost Innocence, had recommended to help slow down the decomposition process so that you can bury your child. So, after this happened and like I was starting, to have a moment of relief, I asked for a popsicle. I was like still in the tub, and I asked for a popsicle because I started to feel a little faint, and I also felt like I was disassociating a little bit because of how intense the experience was. And my body was shaking. It's just like, again, natural, instinctual, bodily reactions from something that intense. I knew I was going to be okay. But it was just, I was like, I asked for a popsicle because usually like one of the methods that I use to help cope with like disassociation and panic, because it's something that I've dealt with for a long time, is like anything cold or something very sweet usually helps take me out of it. And so Ryan brought me the popsicle, and I just focused on eating it while I continued to release the rest of the bigger clots in my body. I had maybe one or two come out after the baby had come out. And I just like knew, like, okay, the worst is over. And even Brooke kept saying, like, the worst is over. Like, that was it. Like, that was the hardest part. And I agree. It was the hardest part. Physically, it was the hardest part. It was very intense. But as I saw, like, the bigger, the rest of the clots come out in the tub, I just started crying, and I just told Ryan and Brooke, I'm okay. I'm just like so sad, like, and they just cried with me and held me until I calmed down. We did end up emptying and filling the tub about 3 times during this entire time that I was in it, because I didn't want to risk getting an infection. And so we would like clean me up, refill it, and then like if more would come out, we would empty it again, clean me up again. So it was we were trying to be wise with that. And after a little while, I finally felt stable enough to transfer from the tub to the bed. And so Ryan and Brooke got me clean clothes and helped wipe me off and walked me to the bed, where I stayed for the rest of the day. And, after they both knew, like, okay, she's in the bed, Ryan started cleaning up the bathroom from the chaos that we had created. And Brooke was like cutting me up some fruit and bringing me up fruit and water and just sitting with me and making sure I was stable. And after I'd kind of stabilized, I got my strength back, I was still experiencing light contractions for a few hours, but it eventually sizzled out and just went back to normal cramping. And I told Brooke she could go home at that point, because I knew I was stable enough for, she could leave for a little while and rest and, eat, shower, whatever she needed to do. But I did ask if she could come back, because I just wanted her to be with me. And so Ryan and I had a few hours alone while she was gone, and Ryan laid in bed with me and, held me, and Ryan got the jar where our child was, and we held the baby together. And it was very hard to look at it and to look at our baby, and knowing that their soul was in glory and that they were no longer with us. It was just really sobering, very surreal, and very hard. Ryan took some pictures of us holding our baby, which was very sweet, as hard and graphic as it was. I'm very thankful he was stable enough mentally to do that, because I wouldn't have thought to do that, because I was still trying to come down from like the crazy experience. And he, took some pictures of like our wedding rings with it, and it's just precious things that we'll have for ourselves, our private pictures of us with our baby. It was very precious. I praised God that whole day for his mercy to me, for providing Ryan and Brooke the strength to help me, for that real supernatural peace that just flooded the room, that was so tangible and so real, and that I had no complications. I didn't hemorrhage, I didn't have any signs of infection, and I was able to deliver our baby at home without any intervening or hospital visit. I think about the tail end of when I was in the tub, I think the meds started to kick in a little bit, which was helpful. And that helped me kind of get through the next few hours of, cramping and stuff. So Brooke came back that night, and Ryan went on another long walk, and she just kind of stayed with me, and we talked about what happened, and we processed it together, and she truly had given me a gift that I can never repay. Like, truly, she gave me the last bit of strength that I needed to deliver our child. Brooke and I both agreed that what we had experienced earlier was truly filled with the peace of God. It was just like we all knew it was so real, it was so beautiful and heartbreaking, and it was just this experience that, as much as I can try to explain it here in this podcast talking about it, I just can't explain it. Like, only Ryan and Brooke know, like, what happened, truly in that room. Um, it was very real and a very spiritual experience that I'm so thankful for, even though it was so sad and so heartbreaking. I pray that this is a day that I never forget. God had orchestrated and ordained that moment for our child's body to be born. And I was in deep, deep mourning, but also in deep worship of the creator of life and the one who takes away life. And that was a very faith strengthening day for me. This entire process has been faith strengthening. It's shown me how weak my faith is and how much I need the Lord, and how much I don't control anything in my life, that He has decreed all things, and I can rest and truly trust in His goodness, even in something so painful. That experience that day brought my husband and I closer together in a whole new way. Like, we were parents and our baby's soul was with the Lord. And I remember Ryan, like, had told me, like, that day, he's like, I will never look at you the same again. Just like in a positive way. Like, it's just, you just experience this extreme heartache with somebody you love, and it just grows you together, It also just grew my relationship with Brooke in such a deep way, because she went so above and beyond what a friend is required to do. Like, she truly exhibited, like, the traits of a friend who's closer than a brother, like the proverb says. Like, just like went above and beyond to be there for me in an extremely intimate and hard way. So that day I was extremely physically drained, obviously, but my spirit was full of peace and comfort. So the couple days following, about 3 days, my body was kind of in the thick of recovery. I stayed in bed and I struggled with ongoing cramping and heavy bleeding, but we monitored me closely for signs again of infection or hemorrhage, and none of those signs were happening. I was very, very blessed to be spared from those things. So I just continued to read and watch comforting things. Those days were still hard because Ryan and I were struggling with, again, the fresh sting of death in our family. But God was still with us these days, truly. And the days do blend together in my mind because they were full of a lot of the same things. Up and down from the bathroom, more meals brought in from church members, texts and calls from our loved ones, crying, missing our baby, And so that Thursday, so I had passed the baby on Monday, and then Thursday I went to a follow-up appointment with my OB-GYN, and it was a dreaded ultrasound appointment, and I was not looking forward to it. But after telling my doctor the details of the miscarriage and the delivery, she felt confident that I had successfully passed the baby and the placenta. So she gave me a pelvic exam, which was very painful. Do not recommend. But I was thankful that I had to do that and not the ultrasound. So I kind of opted for that because the ultrasound was just going to be more emotionally hard for me. So it was still painful because my lady bits were very sore, and tender, but it was over pretty fast, thankfully. And my doctor encouraged me that things seemed to be going well, but to just keep watching out for any warning signs. And we got some blood work done, and my HCG levels had dropped drastically, which was a good sign that, things had been moving along well. The day after my OB-GYN appointment, May 17th, which is the day I announced on my social media that that our baby had died, and we had buried it. This was the day that we buried our baby's body, and our baby's name is Eden. I may have mentioned it a few times already, but in my journal, this is when I finally say the baby's name is Eden. So that's why I'm saying it. So it's hard for me to remember the day that we named our baby, but Ryan brought the idea to me, and I thought it was perfect. Eden is perfect. We didn't know the gender of our baby, and so that's why I'm not using he, she pronouns with our baby, because we don't know our baby's gender, but God has chosen it, and I don't feel comfortable misgendering our baby, essentially. I know a lot of people like have these gut feelings, like I know it was a girl or I know it was a boy when they have, a pregnancy loss before they find out what the gender was. But Ryan and I just didn't really feel any sort of gut feeling. I wanted a boy, he wanted a girl. We were so thankful for any gender. We were just kind of like, I don't know, like maybe it's just something that we're going to have to find out in glory. And so that's kind of why we chose a more gender neutral name. And also, we named our baby Eden because our baby is in paradise. And our world is not as it should be, filled with sin and death. So, the morning of the burial, we went to our Lowe's, which is like if you don't know what Lowe's is, it's like everywhere in the United States. I know we have people that listen out of the country. Excuse me. But Lowe's is like a hardware store slash like landscaping. It's like a huge business chain. But they have a landscaping section, and so we went and we picked a pot and we picked a plant and we got some soil, and we decided to bury our baby's body in it. And I know that might be difficult for some people to hear because it's kind of weird for some people. And I just want to emphasize that, like, I was preparing that we may not be able to recover our child's body. And there are so many women that didn't have the privilege of burying their child because it was either an emergency situation and they panic, and then they don't think of, trying to retrieve the body, or like they had to go to the hospital and the hospital wouldn't give it to them. There's so many circumstances where like it's so heartbreaking and so hard that like a mother cannot like have that closure of burying their child's body. And so I realize and I understand with so much depth, like especially knowing my sisters in Christ, like in their stories, I'm very privileged to have been able to bury my child's body and to have held my baby in my hands. Like I'm very, very, very blessed by that. And it was a mercy from the Lord that I could do that. And I know it's probably confusing to some people. But my child's body mattered, their life mattered, no matter how small. And it was very hard to bury the child. It was very hard to watch. I had Ryan do that part, and I just kind of sat on a chair and watched because, again, I was still recovering. I was still not physically able to like get up a lot. So we filled the pot with rocks and soil, and then Ryan brought out the jars of our baby's body and the placenta pieces that we had recovered. And he held the baby one last time in his hands, and I just like sobbed. As he placed it in the dirt, I just felt gutted. I felt like I couldn't breathe because I knew that this was the last time I would lay my eyes on my child this side of glory. And so we sat and looked at our child's body one last time. And then I gave, kind of the okay, like, it's okay, we can cover it. And so I watched as Ryan covered the baby's body with dirt, and then I kind of took over the planting part. I planted lavender on it, and it was very symbolic, you know, planting flowers over it. And yeah, we just kind of meditated on the loss. We sang a psalm, we read some scripture, we prayed, and we just kind of sat silently with our baby. And, we experienced some closure by doing that. And also, like, it was a privilege to be able to bury our child. And we have hope in the resurrection and the last day when our child's body will be reunited with their soul. So we are still currently in the thick of mourning. Obviously, this was very recent. From the time I'm recording this, it was about a week and a half ago since I delivered the baby, and not even a week since we buried our baby. And I'm still physically recovering. A lot has improved in the past couple days. I was able to move from upstairs to downstairs on the couch, which was great. I'm able to walk around a little bit more. My bleeding has slowed down. My cramping is like almost non-existent now, thank God. So I have a lot to be thankful for. Seems like I'm more on the tail end of the physical recovery now. I'm just very tired and drained, and I think a lot of that has to do with just grieving. So, like I said, we have so much hope in the resurrection. We have so much hope that our child is with the Lord. We have so much confidence in God's mercy to the children of believers. We are very, very, very thankful to know where our child is and know that we will go to them. And a lot of people may have questions about like what's kind of next for us, and I understand people are curious, they want to know, like, okay, like, are you guys going to try again immediately? Are you guys going to take a break from trying to conceive? Like, what's the plan? And my answer for that is that we are focusing on grieving and healing from this experience. And, my doctor's super involved and monitoring me. And, my doctor's involved with my fertility and involved with my particular situation and when my body will be ready for pregnancy again. And also our pastor is super involved with our spiritual and emotional well-being, and we have a lot of support and love from the people around us. And I don't have an answer to any of those questions right now because, like we have from the beginning of our marriage, we've trusted the Lord with our fertility. We've trusted the Lord with my womb. We've trusted in his perfect plan for our life and our family. And we will continue to do that. And, even though there may be a time where we need to focus on grieving and not like so hardcore trying to get pregnant, like the Lord opens the womb when he wills, and we trust that he will again in his perfect timing. And, we don't know better than him. He knows what is best for us. He knows what is good for us. And it may be confusing for people, especially those that aren't Christians, but we believe that God only gives us good gifts. And it may be confusing to hear me say that as horrible and sad as the situation was, like, this child, like, wasn't for me. This child belonged to the Lord from the beginning of their conception, and the Lord decided to take our child to be with him very early in their life. And I have so much peace about that. Even though I'm grieving as a mother, I'm rejoicing as a Christian because I know my baby is in the immediate presence of Christ. So, I hope that answers any questions regarding the future of our family. So, I just want to end the podcast by saying, praise be to the Lord who gives and takes away life, who opens and closes the womb, and who is infinite, eternal, and unchangeable. Praise be to the Lord. talk to you guys next time.